James Carter, 29 years old in every way that mattered, had exactly one thought as he opened his eyes to a wall of camera flashes. I really should have read past chapter 12. The last thing I remembered, the real last thing, was a rooftop extraction gone sideways in a city I'm still not allowed to name, followed by a very bright light that was definitely not supposed to be there. Now I was standing on a marble step outside a Chicago hotel, wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than my old government salary, while a dozen reporters screamed my name at me. Except it wasn't my name, it was his. James Carter, 24, Chicago's favorite spoiled omega, currently 3 seconds away from being formally announced as the fiancé of a man the tabloids called the January Dawn. Great. Wonderful. I'd transmigrated into the world of a Boyslove novel my old coworker forced on me during a stakeout, and I'd landed in the body of the character everyone online agreed was kind of a disaster. A reporter shoved a microphone toward my face. "Mr. Carter, is it true you're marrying William Russo for the money?" Old me, the guy who used to sit across from foreign intelligence officers and read their next 3 lies before they finished the first one, did not panic. Old me clocked the exits, counted the security detail, noticed the photographer angling for an ambush shot, and calmly decided this whole situation was, frankly, beneath the effort of panicking. "No," I said, voice smooth as anything. "I'm marrying him because he has excellent taste in real estate, and I have excellent taste in spending his money on it." Dead silence. Then laughter. The hostile reporter actually lowered her mic, half charmed, half confused. That's when I felt it. A presence at my back, tall enough to throw a shadow over the whole staircase. Cologne like cedarwood and something colder underneath. A smell that snagged at something in the back of my mind, familiar in a way I couldn't place, like a name on the tip of your tongue. I turned, and there he was. William Russo, 35, head of Russo Holdings, and, according to the 11 forum threads I definitely hadn't read yet, the single most terrifying man in Chicago's underworld. Dark charcoal suit, tailored within an inch of its life, a silver ring on his pinky finger, and an expression like he'd never once in his life been surprised by anything. He was surprised now. I could see it. Just barely. Just at the corner of his mouth, like his brain had crashed trying to reconcile spoiled, sheltered fiancé with the sentence I'd just delivered to the press without blinking. Old James, according to what I'd absorbed of his memories, was supposed to be terrified of William Russo. Supposed to be shaking, clinging, praying for an escape route from this whole arranged marriage disaster. There were whole fragments of memory sitting in my head like someone else's diary, a panicked voicemail to a friend, 3 separate attempts to fake a stomach flu, a folder on his phone literally labeled Ways Out that contained nothing but screenshots of other people's failed engagements for inspiration. New James, the one currently doing threat assessment on every person within 30 feet, mostly just wanted to know if the hotel served food, because apparently spontaneous interrogation of hostile reporters worked up an appetite. I filed the Ways Out folder away for later, mostly out of professional curiosity, and made a note that whoever wrote this character clearly had a lot of opinions about omegas that I intended to personally disprove out of sheer spite. William stepped down beside me, close enough that his shadow swallowed mine whole. He didn't say anything to the press. He didn't have to. His silence did all the talking their microphones couldn't catch. If this kind of chaos is your thing, stick around. There's a lot more of it coming, and it only gets messier from here. Follow along so you don't miss it. Right before his security ushered us both inside, he looked down at me, really looked, the way people look at a puzzle piece that doesn't match the box, and said the first thing I'd hear from him. "You're not what I expected." "Buddy," I thought, following him through the doors, and directly into whatever came next, "you have absolutely no idea." Turns out, waking up in someone else's chaos comes with paperwork. Specifically, it comes with a very thick folder that Ethan Blake slid across a marble table an hour after the press conference, along with a look that said you should probably read this before you sign anything else with your face. Let me back up. By the time I'd absorbed a full night's worth of old James's memories, helped along by a truly aggressive amount of coffee, I understood the shape of the trap I was standing in. The Carter family, once comfortably wealthy, had spent the last 3 years quietly hemorrhaging money through bad investments nobody in the family wanted to admit to. William Russo, head of Russo Holdings, and apparently the only man in Chicago capable of making an entire boardroom go silent by clearing his throat, needed a marriage that would smooth over some very old, very thorny political tensions between his family and half the Gold Coast elite. So, an engagement. Convenient for the Carters, who got their finances quietly rescued. Convenient for William, who got a peace treaty with a ring on it. Deeply, catastrophically inconvenient for the 24-year-old Omega, whose body I was currently borrowing, who, according to what I could piece together, was terrified of the entire Russo family, hated the idea of marrying into organized crime with plausible deniability, and had spent the last several weeks trying every trick in the book to get out of it, none of which had worked, because, as I was quickly learning, William Russo did not react to things the way normal people did. "You're being very quiet," William said across the table. "We were having dinner, our second one, this time without reporters, at a restaurant that overlooked the Chicago River, all soft gold lighting and a wine list I didn't understand and didn't need to." William sat across from me in another perfectly tailored suit, dark navy this time, radiating the kind of stillness that made waitstaff visibly relax their shoulders when they finally got to leave our table. "I'm working up to being loud," I said. "Give me a minute." He didn't smile exactly. Something moved near the corner of his mouth, though, like a smile that had been filed down to regulation size, and wasn't allowed to show its full teeth. It was, again, a little too familiar, like I'd watched that exact restrained almost smile before, on someone else, somewhere I couldn't place. I filed the feeling away under jet lag from interdimensional travel, deal with it later, and kept going. I decided this was as good a time as any to launch Operation. Get dumped. The plan, as I'd scribbled it in a note on my phone at 2 a.m, was embarrassingly simple. Convince William Russo that his fiancé was a shallow, high-maintenance disaster and let nature take its course. No CIA training required, just vibes. "I want the tasting menu," I said. "All 9 courses. And that dessert wine, the one that's, what, $400 a glass?" $380, William said, not even glancing at the menu. "Even better." He signaled the waiter without breaking eye contact with me, like he was waiting to see what I'd do next, the way you'd watch a raccoon that had wandered into your kitchen. Curious, mildly concerned, not yet alarmed, I ordered everything. I ordered a second dessert I had no intention of eating. I asked sweetly if they could box up a third portion for later, which was a lie, because old James apparently didn't even like the restaurant's signature dish. William paid the bill without looking at it. "Anything else?" he asked. I panicked slightly. Internally, of course, my face stayed perfectly serene and reached for the most outrageous thing I could think of. I saw a penthouse, Upper East Side, in New York. I want it. I expected outrage, a raised eyebrow at minimum. Some flicker of this Omega is a nightmare, and I should call off this engagement immediately. William pulled out his phone, typed something, and put it away. "I'll have my lawyer check if it's still on the market." I stared at him. This man, I thought, has never once in his life been told no, and it shows. Mission failed spectacularly. On the first real attempt. That's when Ethan Blake entered the picture properly, not literally at dinner, but the next morning, in the form of a phone call summoning me to William's office building downtown. Ethan Blake, 31, Beta, William's personal lawyer and the only person in the Russo orbit who seemed to find the whole engagement mildly entertaining rather than politically terrifying. He wore a navy suit that was nice but noticeably less expensive than William's, thin wire-rimmed glasses, and carried a tablet he tapped at constantly, like a man taking meticulous notes on a nature documentary only he could see. "You're new," he said, by way of greeting, looking me over like I was a piece of evidence that didn't match the case file. "I get that a lot," I said, which was true in ways he couldn't possibly understand. "No, I mean," he tilted his head. "You checked the bill before you signed for the wine last night. Twice. Most people in your position don't check bills. They just enjoy being rich." I froze for exactly half a second, then recovered with the practiced ease of a man who had once talked his way past a hostile checkpoint, using nothing but a fake accent and sheer confidence. "Force of habit," I said. "TikTok told me rich people get scammed by restaurants all the time." Ethan blinked slowly, then wrote something down on his tablet. I did not love that. He handed me the folder, the engagement contract, thick as a phone book, full of clauses about assets and public appearances, and something called a family stability agreement, that I made a mental note to actually read later, because apparently that's what normal fiancés did, instead of skimming it and signing on faith like old James clearly had been about to do. You should read it, Ethan said, echoing my earlier thought with unsettling precision. Some people don't. Mr. Russo appreciates people who do. Is that a compliment or a warning? With him, Ethan said, glancing toward William's closed office door. It's usually both. I did read the contract. All of it in one sitting, curled up on William's absurdly expensive office couch while he took a call in the next room. I read it the way I used to read hostile diplomatic cables, fast, thorough, flagging every inconsistency, and found, buried in a subclause about quarterly financial disclosures, a small mathematical error. The whole clause referenced a set of figures that had never been updated after a merger the year before, meaning any calculation built on it would be quietly, permanently wrong. When William came back in, I should have kept my mouth shut. Old James definitely would have. Instead, my brain did the thing it always did, completely without my permission. This clause is wrong, I said, tapping the page. Section 4, the quarterly disclosure language. It's still referencing the pre-merger revenue baseline. If your accounting team builds anything off this contract without catching it, every forecast downstream is going to be off. The room went very quiet. William looked at the page, then at me, then at the page again, like he was checking whether I was right, which I was. Obviously, I don't make mistakes about numbers, and then back at me with an expression I couldn't quite categorize yet, except that it wasn't the bored tolerance he'd worn through most of dinner the night before. Who taught you that? He asked. I opened my mouth to say YouTube, remembered I'd already used that excuse mentally once today, and switched at the last second. I'm very bored a lot, I said instead, which was somehow worse. William didn't push. He just looked at me for a long 5 seconds. The kind of look that made me deeply aware I'd have to be far more careful, and then said quietly, almost to himself, Ethan, have someone fix Section 4. Ethan, from the doorway, was already typing. I smiled, ate one of the very expensive chocolates on William's desk without asking, and made a private, urgent note to be significantly stupider tomorrow. Which would have been a fine plan if William hadn't chosen that exact moment to mention, with the same flat calm he used to discuss 8-figure real estate deals, that his grandmother was flying in from Austin next week, and that she'd specifically requested to meet his fiancé alone. I did not like the sound of alone. I liked it even less when Ethan, behind William's back, mouthed the words, good luck, like a man watching someone walk into traffic. The meeting itself, when it finally happened 4 days later, turned out to be the least dramatic thing to happen to me since I'd woken up in this body. Rosalind Russo, 78, matriarch of the Russo family, showed up in a bright coral pantsuit with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a purse the size of a small suitcase. She sat me down over tea, studied my face for approximately 11 seconds, and asked, without preamble, whether I preferred lemon cake or chocolate for the wedding, because she'd already put a deposit down on a bakery, just in case. I had braced for an interrogation. I got a dessert consultation. You're not what I pictured, she said, pouring tea like she owned the room, which, technically, she probably did. I get that a lot lately, I said, and meant it more than she knew. She patted my hand, told me William hadn't smiled properly in 6 years until the gossip pages caught his ears going red at dinner with me, and left 40 minutes later with my cell number and a promise to call about seating charts. He was a serious child. You know, she added, almost as an afterthought, halfway out the door with her enormous purse over one shoulder. Never cried, never threw tantrums. I used to worry something was wrong with him, a boy that quiet, that careful. Like he'd decided very young that feelings were a liability he couldn't afford. Then he brings home a fiancé who spends $80,000 in an afternoon and argues with reporters for sport, and suddenly he's laughing on the phone with me at midnight about a chair. The chair situation is a whole separate conversation, I said. I'm sure it is, she said, entirely unbothered, and left me standing in the doorway turning that over in my head for a lot longer than I meant to. I sat there a while after she left, oddly unsettled by how easy it had been, before deciding not to examine that particular feeling too closely either. Okay, challenge accepted. After the contract disaster and the surprisingly painless grandmother summit, I decided the problem wasn't my strategy. The problem was that I hadn't gone big enough yet. Old James had spent weeks trying to annoy William Russo with small stuff. I decided to escalate like a professional. William invited me to sit in on a business meeting. Something about logistics contracts. 3 men in suits who all looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I decided this was the perfect moment to demonstrate exactly how useless a fiancé I could be. I curled up on the office couch behind him, hugged a throw pillow, and announced, with maximum theatrical fatigue, "I'm an omega. I need a nap." I fully expected this to read as spoiled, high-maintenance, embarrassing. Instead, William, mid-sentence, discussing shipping tariffs like a man reading a grocery list, reached over without breaking eye contact with the men across the table, dimmed the office lights by 2 settings, and quietly told his assistant to move the meeting to the smaller conference room so we don't disturb him. I woke up 2 hours later under his suit jacket. His actual suit jacket. The one that probably cost more than a used car. I stared at the ceiling for a solid 10 seconds, processing. Somewhere, I thought, there is a very expensive training manual for Mafia bosses, and William Russo skipped the entire chapter on being intimidated by inconvenience. I found him afterward in the smaller conference room, mid-negotiation, laptop open, 3 logistics executives nodding along to something about port fees. He didn't stop talking when I leaned in the doorway. He just angled his laptop screen a half-inch, without breaking his sentence, so the executives couldn't see the message he'd typed and left sitting there for me. "Did you sleep well?" I typed back on my own phone from across the room because apparently we were doing this now. "You stole a nap I was using as a weapon. This is a war crime." He read it, and one of the executives later swore, in a story that made its way back to me through Ethan, that Chicago's most feared businessman had smiled at his phone in the middle of a 9-figure negotiation for absolutely no reason anyone in the room could identify. Fine, sleep hadn't worked. Money would. I took one of William's cards. He'd handed me one during the contract signing, apparently as a formality, and spent an aggressive, deliberate, almost artistic amount of it in a single afternoon. 3 suits I didn't need, a watch, a ridiculous amount of skincare that I was fairly sure old James had never once used correctly. I laid the receipts out on the kitchen counter that evening, like evidence at a crime scene, bracing for the explosion. William looked at the total. Didn't blink. "Why did you only buy things for yourself?" he asked. I opened my mouth, closed it. This was not the direction I'd wargamed. "Because they're my clothes?" I said, immediately aware this sounded less like an argument and more like a confused question. The next morning, there was a second card on the kitchen table. No spending limit mentioned. Just a small note in William's handwriting. "For both of us, buy something you think I'd like." I stood there holding 2 black cards like a man who had tried to start a fire and instead built the man a house. "This is insane," I muttered to the empty kitchen. "I am trying to be a financial liability, and he's just expanding the liability." I decided to test the limits properly, because if I was going down, I was going down thoroughly. I spent the rest of the week buying deliberately impractical things in William's name. A life-size bronze statue of a heron for the lobby, a subscription to a magazine about competitive falconry, a single extremely ugly velvet armchair that clashed with every other piece of furniture in the penthouse. Each purchase arrived within 48 hours, unpacked by staff who didn't so much as blink. The armchair I actually got a reaction to. William walked in, looked at it sitting in the middle of the living room like a crime scene, and said with real gravity, "That's the ugliest chair I've ever seen." "I know," I said, delighted. "Are we fighting now? Please say we're fighting now." "No," William said, sitting down in it anyway, folding his hands like a man conducting a board meeting from an armchair upholstered in what could only be described as aggressive burgundy. "I like that you bought it because you thought I'd hate it. That's a very specific kind of attention. That's not a compliment, that's a diagnosis." "With you," he said, "it's usually both. I left the chair exactly where it was, mostly out of spite, and it has remained there, unchanged and unloved by literally everyone who visits, for 2 years. By the 3rd week, I'd graduated to bigger stages. Literally. A charity gala at a hotel ballroom in New York, the kind of event with a string quartet and enough old money in the room to buy a small country. I decided this was the night to make William Russo, famously composed, famously untouchable, visibly, publicly uncomfortable. Halfway through a conversation with 2 Russo Holdings board members, I looped my arm through his, leaned into his shoulder, and said, loud enough for the small circle around us to hear, "William, my feet hurt. Can we go home?" The ballroom did that thing where conversation doesn't stop completely, but drops in volume, because everyone within earshot suddenly needs to eavesdrop without looking like they're eavesdropping. Half the room, I realized later, had been quietly betting on how long it would take before William Russo showed the first crack of irritation toward his spoiled new fiancé. His ears went red first. Then he looked down at me, and instead of the icy dismissal I was braced for, he asked, low and completely serious, "Do you want to leave now? You're not embarrassed? Should I be?" "I feel like you should be," I said. "I'm actively trying to embarrass you." Something almost like amusement flickered across his face, gone as fast as it came, but I clocked it. "You're doing a poor job of it." By the next morning, a Gold Coast gossip site had run a story with the headline, "The January Dawn Finally Melts," complete with a photo of William's very red ears and a caption calling it the most affection anyone has seen from William Russo in a decade. Comment sections were, unfortunately, delighted. Old James's tabloid nightmare had somehow, overnight, become Chicago's favorite couple. Ethan forwarded me the article with a single line attached. "This is the opposite of what you were going for, I assume." "You assume correctly," I typed back. "Do you have any advice for a man actively losing a war against his own fiancé's charm?" "Surrender," Ethan wrote. "It's faster." I put my head down on the kitchen table and stayed there for several minutes. "This isn't going the way I planned," I told the countertop. I decided the problem was that all my previous plans had required William to be annoyed by something, so I switched tactics entirely. Instead of annoying him, I'd bore him. I'd be the least interesting, least capable fiancé in Chicago history. Surely no self-respecting mafia boss wanted to marry someone who couldn't follow a spreadsheet. William handed me a customs manifest over breakfast, casually, like he does everything, and asked what I thought of a shipment delay one of his logistics managers was blaming on paperwork issues. "I don't really get this stuff," I said, doing my best impression of someone whose eyes were glazing over a wall of shipping codes, which would have worked fine if my eyes hadn't also, treacherously, actually read the manifest and noticed the anomaly. My mouth, completely without consulting the rest of me, said, "Wait, this container's classified under the wrong tariff code. Whoever filed this used last year's schedule, that's why customs is holding it. It's not a delay problem, it's a paperwork problem, but not the kind your manager thinks." Silence. William set down his coffee. I stared at my own hand like it had personally betrayed me. "YouTube," I said too fast. "You said TikTok last time," William said. "Damn it." Caught in my own lie by a man who apparently tracked which fake streaming platform I credited for my suspicious competence. "I contain multitudes," I said, with as much dignity as I could scrape together. William didn't push. He never did, which was somehow worse than if he had. But he watched me for a long moment over his coffee cup, the kind of look that made the back of my neck prickle with old, familiar instincts. The look of someone updating a file in their head. File update, subject, fiancé. I imagined it reading, status, not as advertised. I decided the last frontier was William's inner circle. Surely if I could embarrass him in front of the people who actually mattered to him, something would finally crack. Rosalind was hosting a small family dinner the following week, low-key by Russo standards, meaning only about 20 relatives instead of 200 strangers. I arrived wearing the loudest thing in my closet, a neon green tracksuit, old James had apparently bought on a whim and never worn, and spent the appetizer course loudly recounting a fake story about accidentally wiring money to the wrong charity because I didn't read the form. Rosalind laughed so hard she had to set down her wine. "Oh, I like him," she announced to the table, patting my hand. "He's funny. William hasn't brought anyone funny to dinner in years." I sat there in my neon disaster of an outfit, watching my humiliation plan get reclassified as charming family entertainment in real time, while William, at the head of the table, wore the expression of a man who had given up trying to predict what I'd do next and had simply decided to enjoy the show. "You're supposed to hate this," I whispered to him, under the noise of his uncle telling a very long story about a boat. "I'm aware," William whispered back. "I've stopped expecting logic from you. It's working out better this way. I should have stopped there." 5 failed missions was already an embarrassing track record for someone who used to plan actual extractions for a living. But pride is a hell of a drug, and by the following week I'd convinced myself the answer was jealousy. If I couldn't make William dislike me, maybe I could make him want to give up on me instead, hand the whole engagement over to someone less complicated. At a dinner with a few of William's associates, I gestured vaguely across the room and said, with theatrical wistfulness, "I think I like alphas who are a bit more fun, younger maybe." I picked a random guy near the bar, Didn't even know his name yet. William followed my gaze, said nothing, and went unnervingly quiet for the rest of the evening. I considered this progress, a win even, right up until 3 days later, when I walked past his study and caught him. William Russo, feared head of one of Chicago's oldest families, a man who apparently hadn't smiled on camera in a decade, standing in front of the hallway mirror, practicing what could generously be called a casual laugh. I stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds, processing. "What are you doing?" I finally asked. He turned, face resetting instantly to its usual controlled calm. "Nothing." I looked at the mirror, looked at him, looked at the mirror again, and then I lost it, genuinely, helplessly. Doubled over, laughing in a way old James's delicate reputation had probably never survived before. William's ears went scarlet. He didn't say anything. He just walked past me down the hall with the dignity of a man, pretending very hard that this had never happened, while I leaned against the doorframe, wheezing, thinking. The most feared man in Chicago can apparently silence a boardroom with one look, but he cannot survive me finding him rehearsing a personality in the mirror. That should have been funny. It was funny, but somewhere underneath the laughing, a small, quiet, deeply inconvenient part of my brain filed away the fact that William Russo, cold, controlled, utterly unbothered by anything I'd thrown at him so far, had spent 3 days trying to be someone more fun just because I'd said I liked that better. I decided not to examine that thought too closely. Old habits. Compartmentalize now, panic later. Unfortunately, later arrived faster than expected because 2 nights after the mirror incident, Ethan showed up at the penthouse with his tablet in hand, an expression like a man who'd just found something very interesting in a spreadsheet, and a single sentence that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. "Mr. Russo wants to know where you learned to read pheromone masking patterns off a stranger's collar from across a room. He noticed you do it. Twice. I hadn't even realized I'd done it out loud." Ethan's tablet question hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before I recovered. "I read a lot," I said. "Crime podcasts. You'd be surprised what sticks." Ethan wrote something down, unconvinced, and, instead of dropping it, asked if he could borrow my opinion on a set of financial documents later that week, dropping his voice just enough to make it clear this wasn't really a request about my opinion at all. I said yes before I'd fully thought it through, mostly because some old professional instinct recognized a fellow analyst offering a truce. I didn't have time to dwell on any of it, because the following week brought Chicago's social calendar roaring back to life, and with it, 2 people whose sole personality trait seemed to be making my life difficult. Charles Russo, 42, Alpha, William's cousin, and a standing member of the Russo Holdings Board. He wore 3-piece suits even to casual lunches, carried an antique pocket watch he checked constantly like the rest of us were wasting his time, and had the specific energy of a man who'd spent his whole life being the smartest guy in a room full of people who didn't know they were being condescended to. Charles cornered me at a charity luncheon, the kind of event where the shrimp cocktail costs more than my old monthly rent, with a smile so polite it practically had a knife folded into it. "James," he said, "I do hope you understand the weight of what you're marrying into. Russo Holdings isn't just money, it's legacy, reputation, certain standards." "Sure," I said, popping a shrimp into my mouth. "Standards like the ones that had your name flagged twice on the guest list for donating to a PAC that got investigated for fraud? Those standards?" Charles's smile went very still. I hadn't actually known that when I woke up that morning. I'd just spent the elevator ride up, doing what I always did. Reading the room, clocking the tension in his jaw when Russo Holdings' compliance officer walked by, connecting 2 dots that were sitting right there in plain sight if you bothered to look. "Old habits die very hard." "That was resolved," Charles said tightly. "Good for you," I said. "I love a redemption arc." He recovered fast, though, credit where it's due, and switched tactics mid-sip of his sparkling water. "You know, James, William has always had a certain type, educated, composed, politically useful." He looked me over, slow and deliberate. "You're none of those things. I do wonder what changed." "Beats me," I said cheerfully. "Maybe he just got tired of dating spreadsheets." Charles's jaw ticked. He checked his pocket watch again. A nervous habit disguised as impatience, and I caught myself cataloging it the way I used to catalog tells in a debrief room. Reflexive, unstoppable, entirely unhelpful to the version of me currently pretending shrimp cocktail was the most interesting thing happening at this table. We'll see how long that lasts, he said, and left shortly after, pocket watch and all. I made a mental note. Charles didn't like being caught off guard, and he checked that watch every single time he did, filed under useful. Michael Grant, 30 years old, dominant Omega, New York socialite, and, according to at least 4 separate conversations I'd overheard at galas, the one everyone expected William to actually marry. He dressed exclusively in cream-colored suits, moved like he'd been raised by an etiquette coach with a grudge, and had the unnerving habit of complimenting you in a tone that made the compliment sound like an insult wearing a nice coat. Michael's test came at a private dinner 2 weeks later, hosted by one of William's business partners. He sat across from me, swirled a glass of wine that was almost certainly worth more than my entire outfit, and asked, sweet as poison, "Do you know where this vintage is from, James?" "No idea," I said honestly. "Pity. I'd think, given how invested you are in this family now, you'd have picked up a few things." He smiled. "Though I suppose some people simply aren't built for this world." I looked at his glass. Then at the bottle on the table, which had a label clearly printed with a vineyard name, and a year that didn't match what he'd just poured. "You switched the labels," I said pleasantly. "Twice, actually. I watched you do it to the woman next to you first, testing whether people fake knowing wine they don't. Kind of a mean trick for a dinner party, don't you think?" Michael's smile froze solid. "That's a very specific accusation," he said, recovering with impressive speed for someone who'd just been caught mid-scheme. "It's a very specific label mismatch," I said. "I'm just reading what's in front of me." He set his glass down a little harder than necessary. "I was simply curious whether you'd bluff your way through it. Most people in your position do." "Most people in my position haven't spent their whole career catching other people bluffing," I said, and immediately regretted the sentence, because it was truer than anything I'd meant to say out loud at a dinner party. Michael tilted his head, something sharpening behind his otherwise perfectly composed expression, like he'd just filed the comment away, for later the same way Ethan filed everything into his tablet. I made a note to be more careful around him, filed under not as harmless as the cream suits suggest. Across the table, William, who had been mid-conversation with someone about zoning permits, turned his head just enough that I caught him fighting down what was unmistakably a laugh. He covered it by lifting his own glass to his mouth, but his eyes, over the rim, were doing all the laughing his face wasn't allowed to. Round 2, as it turned out, arrived faster than I expected. Michael cornered me alone near the terrace later that evening, dropping the sweet act entirely. "I don't understand what William sees in you," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear. "You're not sophisticated. You're not connected. You're an accident waiting to happen to this family's reputation." I could have deflected. Old James definitely would have, probably cried, or fled to the bathroom, or texted his mother in a panic. But something about the phrase "accident waiting to happen" landed slightly too close to a truth I was actively trying to hide, and my patience, thin on a good day, ran out. "You're right," I said. "I'm not sophisticated. I'm something you clearly haven't accounted for." Michael blinked, thrown by my agreeing with him. "Here's a fun fact about accidents," I continued, calm as anything. "The people who cause them usually don't see them coming either. Something to think about next time you're planning one." I walked back inside before he could respond, mostly because I didn't actually know what that last line meant. It had just sounded appropriately ominous in the moment, which frankly was the whole CIA skill set in a nutshell. William found me by the bar 2 minutes later. "What did he say to you?" His voice had dropped into a register I hadn't heard before, quiet even, and somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been. "Nothing important," I said. "James." I looked up. His jaw was tight. And for the first time since I'd landed in this body, I saw something in William Russo that looked less like the composed Mafia boss the tabloids wrote about, and more like a man genuinely, quietly furious on someone else's behalf. "He implied I'm going to embarrass your family," I said, mostly to make him stop looking at me like that. Something shifted behind William's eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply turned, found their host across the room, and said, pleasant as a knife, "I don't recall inviting Michael Grant to the next quarter's gala circuit. Let's make sure that oversight doesn't repeat." Michael, halfway across the room, went visibly pale. I watched an entire social death sentence get delivered in under 15 words, and, I'm not proud of this, found it deeply, embarrassingly attractive. "You didn't have to do that," I said. I wanted to, William said, still watching Michael retreat toward the coat check like a man being quietly erased from Chicago society in real time, then almost too casual. Was he the type you meant? Younger. Fun. I stared at him. Are you? Is this jealousy? Right now? About him? William's ears went the faintest shade of pink, which on a man that composed might as well have been a 5-alarm fire. No, he said, in the exact tone of a man very obviously lying. You've been weird about this since the gala, I said, delighted despite myself. You practiced being fun in a mirror over a guy I made up on the spot. I don't know what you're talking about. Your ears say otherwise. He turned and walked toward the car, refusing to dignify that with a response, which I took as a full confession. It would have been a good night, honestly, a win, even chalked up in the growing column of things that keep going sideways in my favor, if I hadn't caught, on the drive home, a single detail that snagged in my brain like a splinter. Charles's pocket watch. When he'd stormed off from the luncheon earlier that week, I'd caught a flash of something engraved on the inside case, just for half a second before he snapped it shut, a set of initials that didn't belong to him. R.H. I didn't think much of it at the time. Charles collected antiques. It could have been anyone's. Until 3 days later, going through the documents Ethan had quietly asked me to look at, I saw the same initials again. Signed at the bottom of a consulting letter tucked into a much bigger file. Paperwork for a downtown real estate development that Russo Holdings was trying to acquire, and that Charles, according to a line buried on page 9, held a personal financial stake in through a shell entity that didn't share his name, Robert Hayes. The consultant's letterhead. The same man who, according to the file, was quietly advising the competing investor group trying to outbid Russo Holdings for that same development. A deal that would only go through if the Carter-Russo engagement collapsed and took Russo Holdings' credibility with it. I sat very still on the couch for a long moment, old instincts stirring awake somewhere under the spoiled Omega costume I'd been wearing for weeks. Michael's petty. Charles is proud, and he stands to profit either way this engagement ends. Neither of them is smart enough to be running this alone, but both of them are being paid to help someone who is. Somewhere out there, someone was pulling strings, and both of my new least favorite people in Chicago were just the puppets standing in the spotlight, one of them literally being compensated for the performance. I texted Ethan a single line before I went to bed. We need to talk about Robert Hayes. His reply came back in under a minute. I was hoping you'd notice eventually. We met the next morning in a coffee shop 2 blocks from his office, deliberately not the Russo Holdings building, because Ethan had apparently decided this conversation warranted actual tradecraft. He slid his tablet across the table, screen angled away from the window. I've had a file open on Hayes for 3 weeks, he said. Nothing I could take to William yet. Everything circumstantial. But he's been meeting with Charles more than makes sense for a man who's supposedly just consulting on a real estate deal. You never mentioned this. You never confirmed you could actually read financial documents instead of pretending to be bored by them, Ethan said, entirely without malice. I don't loop people into an active investigation on a hunch. I loop them in once they've proven themselves useful. Congratulations, you're useful. That might be the nicest thing anyone in this family has said to me. Don't get used to it, Ethan said, already turning the tablet back around. Now, let's talk about shell accounts. For the next 6 weeks, under cover of spa appointments I never actually attended, and shopping trips that mostly involved sitting in Ethan's car outside a records office, the two of us built the case that would eventually take Robert Hayes apart in front of 300 people. It was, without question, the most fun I'd had since transmigrating, which possibly said something concerning about my priorities, but I decided not to dwell on that either. I found the rest of it 2 nights later, and, true to form, I found it by accident, doing exactly the kind of thing that gets people killed in my old line of work, snooping through someone's private archive while they're on a phone call in the next room. William kept a locked cabinet in his study, the old-fashioned kind, with an actual key instead of a keypad, which honestly should have told me something about how much he trusted digital security. Inside, tucked behind a row of financial ledgers, was a single folder that didn't match the rest. No company letterhead, no case number. Just 2 words, typed on a label gone slightly yellow with age, January blue. My stomach did something complicated and unpleasant because I knew that phrase. Not from this life. From the one before it, a joint operation years back, tracking dirty money moving through a financial network that was quietly funding people who very much should not have had access to that kind of cash. I'd worked the analyst side. I never met the source. I only ever knew them by a call sign, fed to me through 3 layers of secure channels, dropping in clean, precise intel that saved the operation more than once. January. Suddenly the déjà vu made a horrible kind of sense. The cologne that felt familiar the first night, the clipped, precise way William gave instructions that had nagged at me like an old memory I couldn't place. The strange sense of recognition every time he said something in that flat, economical way of his. I'd chalked it all up to nerves. It hadn't been nerves. I sat down on William's study floor, folder in my lap, feeling like the room had quietly tilted 10 degrees. I thought about closing the folder and pretending I'd never seen it. Old instincts told me that was the smart move. Don't reveal what you know until you understand the full picture. New instincts, the ones that had been quietly rewriting themselves ever since I moved into this penthouse, told me I was done keeping things from this particular man, whether or not that was strategically sound. That's where William found me 20 minutes later, phone call finished, standing in the doorway with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the composed mask, not the flicker of amusement, something rawer underneath both. "You went through my things," he said. Not angry, just quiet. "I did," I admitted, because there was no version of this where lying helped. "William, did you ever go by the name January? Financial intelligence work years ago off the books." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the room, sat down across from me on the study floor, like the furniture had suddenly become optional, and reached up to the silver ring he always wore on his little finger, the one I'd seen 100 times without ever really looking at it. He worked it off, slower than the gesture needed to be, and held it out. Engraved on the inside of the band, small enough that you'd never catch it unless you were looking, a single letter, B. A long time ago, before I fully took over the family business, I fed information to a federal contact, William said. Financial patterns. Names. Enough to keep several very bad people from getting the kind of money that gets people killed. In exchange, they kept a certain investigation into my family quietly closed. He turned the ring over once in his fingers. I never met the analyst on the other end. I only had a call sign, Bluebird. I stared at the ring like it might explain itself if I looked hard enough. That was me, I said. In my old life, I was Bluebird. Something in his face, the careful, controlled thing he wore like armor every day of his life, cracked just slightly, just enough to let something else through. I don't fully understand how a source I worked with years ago in one life ended up engaged to me in this one, William said. I've stopped trying to make the math work. I don't think it's supposed to. That's oddly reasonable for a man who runs a crime family. I run a real estate company, he said, deadpan, and I let out a startled laugh despite the lump sitting in my throat. He reached up, tucked a strand of hair back from my face, with a kind of care that didn't match anything the tabloids had ever printed about him, and said, quiet and certain, I don't need to understand it, James. I just need to know you're here now. For once, genuinely, rarely, I didn't have a joke ready. I just sat there on the floor of his study, the ring between us, and let the moment be exactly as big as it was. It lasted about 3 seconds. Okay, that was a lot, I said, clearing my throat. New record. I went a full 3 seconds without saying something deflecting. You should frame this moment. Put a plaque on the floor. William huffed something that was almost a laugh, and the sharp edge of the moment softened into something easier to breathe around. Noted. Also, I added, if the universe is going to recycle people across lifetimes, I'd like it on record that I'm filing a complaint about the paperwork. Nobody warned me. I'll have Ethan draft something, William said, and this time he really did smile. Small, real, nothing filed down about it. For what it's worth, William added, turning the ring over once more before sliding it back onto his finger. I kept it on all these years thinking I'd never know who to thank. Every time a deal fell apart or a shipment got flagged before it could ruin someone, I assumed it was luck. I didn't know it had a name. It had a name, I said. It just also had really bad taste in engagement scenarios, apparently, because I don't think either version of me signed up for this. No, William agreed, but I'm not giving either version back. I let myself lean into his shoulder, ring still warm from his hand, feeling steadier about this whole absurd situation than I had since the moment I'd opened my eyes on that marble staircase. Whatever this was, fate, coincidence, some cosmic clerical error, It had landed me here, and for the first time I wasn't in a hurry to fix that, which was, of course, exactly when my phone buzzed on the floor beside us. A text from Ethan, timestamped 10 minutes past midnight, entirely too calm for what it said. Robert Hayes just confirmed his RSVP for the winter benefit. He's bringing a presentation. Charles is sitting at the head table. I think it's happening this week. William read it over my shoulder, and I felt the easy warmth of the last 10 minutes shift into something sharper, more focused. The version of him I imagined the rest of Chicago underworld actually feared. Then we'd better be ready, he said. I looked down at the ring still resting in his palm, then back up at him, feeling something settle into place that had nothing to do with old call signs or classified files. Good, I said. I've been dying to use a PowerPoint again. Robert Hayes chose the Russo Holdings Winter Benefit for his big finale. 300 guests, a string quartet, a step-and-repeat wall of cameras, and a boardroom full of people who'd all been quietly told, in advance, that something interesting was going to happen tonight. Robert Hayes, 46, beta financial consultant and part-time lobbyist, who split his time between Washington and whatever city currently had money worth moving quietly. He wore pale gray suits that looked expensive right up, until you noticed the cuffs were a half-inch too long, carried a brown leather briefcase like a security blanket, and had the kind of soft, reasonable voice that made everything he said sound true even when it wasn't. He'd spent 2 weeks building his case, feeding documents to Charles, feeding rumors to Michael, and finally feeding the whole story to 3 separate outlets, that James Carter, spoiled Omega with a suspiciously convenient set of hidden talents, had been quietly leaking Russo Holdings' internal financials to outside investors, the very same investor group competing for the development Charles had a quiet stake in, using his engagement as cover. It was, credit where due, a genuinely good lie. It even used real documents, just doctored ones. Ethan and I had known for 4 days by then, which was exactly enough time to prepare. You understand, Ethan said, tablet in hand, standing in William's office the night before the benefit, that if this goes wrong, it goes wrong in front of every major donor and half the Chicago press corps. It's not going to go wrong, I said, from my spot on the couch, upside down, feet hanging over the armrest because sitting normally felt like too much effort for a Tuesday. Robert made 2 mistakes. He built his whole case on an email metadata timestamp, and he's never once considered that I used to do this professionally for a much scarier employer than a Mafia family. William, at his desk, didn't look up from his laptop. Sit up. You'll strain your neck. You're missing the point. I heard the point. Sit up anyway. I sat up, mostly to see the look on his face when I did, which, worth it, honestly, the tiniest twitch of satisfaction before he schooled it back into boardroom neutral. The benefit hall went quiet the moment Robert stood, opened his briefcase, and began his presentation like he was closing an actual business deal instead of publicly assassinating my character. Charles sat at the board table, looking smug in a way that suggested he thought this was already won. Michael watched from near the bar, arms crossed, wearing an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between vindicated and oddly uncertain. I wore white. Cream suit, thin turtleneck, hair actually combed for once, the picture of a harmless, slightly delicate Omega who had absolutely no idea what was coming. "Are you all right?" William murmured, close to my ear, as Robert pulled up his first slide. "No," I said. His hand found mine under the table, ready to pull me out of the room entirely. "I'm hungry," I clarified. "Let's wrap this up quickly so we can get food after." He exhaled something that was almost a laugh and didn't let go of my hand. Robert finished his presentation, emails, spreadsheets, timestamps, a real showman's flourish at the end, and looked entirely too pleased with himself as he closed his laptop. "Are you done?" I asked, standing. "Of course," Robert said, smiling the smile of a man who thought this was already over. "Good, my turn." I opened my own laptop, connected it to the display, and gave the room what I'm told was a genuinely unsettling smile, because apparently spending 3 years reading hostile intelligence reports does something permanent to your face. "Let's start with the metadata," I said. This email, the one supposedly proving I leaked Q3 financials to an outside investor, was edited 4 days after the date it claims to be sent. Here's the original file signature. Slide 2. This spreadsheet uses figures from a version of our internal reports that was never actually published, meaning whoever built this only had access to an earlier incorrect draft. Which is strange, because that draft only ever existed on 3 computers. Mine, Mr. Russo's, and I clicked to slide 3, Robert Hayes's laptop, routed through 3 shell accounts that all funnel back to the same consulting firm, one of which, incidentally, shares a beneficiary with a certain competing bid on a downtown development. Small world. The room had gone very, very quiet. I watched Charles's smug expression curdle in real time as he realized exactly which slide was coming next. I clicked to the final slide. Bold text, centered, entirely for my own amusement. How not to frame a former data analyst. Somewhere near the back, Ethan turned his face away from the crowd, shoulders shaking with the effort of not laughing out loud. I was actually planning to play dumb for a few more months, I said, closing the laptop. But your spreadsheet formatting was genuinely offensive to look at, Robert. I couldn't let that stand. Robert's face had gone the color of old paper. You're twisting the narrative. I'm reading the metadata, I said. The narrative twisted itself the moment you edited a document without checking the audit trail. Robert tried one last angle, voice climbing toward something almost desperate. This is absurd. A former nobody with no financial background, suddenly an expert in forensic accounting? Who exactly are you, Mr. Carter? It was, unfortunately for him, exactly the wrong question to ask a man who used to get paid to answer it very carefully. Someone who reads faster than you edit, I said. Also someone who noticed you filed this complaint through the same law firm that handles Charles Russo's personal investments. Small world again. A ripple went through the crowd. Somewhere near the board table, one of the older directors leaned toward his neighbor and murmured something that ended in the words conflict of interest, loud enough to travel. William stood, finally unhurried, buttoning his jacket, like a man closing a business meeting, rather than ending a small war. Robert, you'll want to speak with our legal team before you leave the building tonight. A pause, the faintest edge of something sharper underneath the calm, preferably before the Tribune finishes their write-up. Robert didn't wait around for legal. He left through the side exit, briefcase still open, papers spilling out behind him like he couldn't get away fast enough. Charles didn't get off much easier, though his punishment came with slightly more mercy and considerably more paperwork. William didn't ruin him publicly. He simply removed his cousin's voting seat on the board and reassigned him, effective immediately, to oversee the family's charitable foundation, along with a very pointed note that his hidden stake in the downtown development would be reviewed for conflict of interest by the same compliance office he'd once tried to distract me with. That's oddly gentle, I said later, once the hall had mostly cleared. He'll be filing compliance reports 8 hours a day for the next year, William said. I considered this. That's genuinely more evil than firing him. I know, William said, and for the first time all night I saw something that looked suspiciously close to a real, unguarded smile. Michael found me near the coat check as I was leaving, looking uncharacteristically subdued. I still don't understand why he likes you, he said, without the usual venom behind it, more curious than cruel. Honestly, neither do I said. For what it's worth, Michael added, straightening a cuff that didn't need straightening, I didn't know Robert was going to go this far. The rumors, sure. This, he gestured vaguely at the emptying ballroom, wasn't the plan I signed up for. You still helped him, I said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact laid flat on the table between us. I did. He met my eyes, and for once there was no performance in it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make myself feel better about it. I appreciated that more than I expected to. It's a rare thing, someone admitting they were wrong without immediately trying to spin it into something more flattering. Send flowers to the office sometime, I said. William likes peonies. Consider it your first step back into decent society. Michael actually laughed, surprised, short, real. I'll take it under advisement. I understand it, William said, appearing at my shoulder with the quiet suddenness that used to unnerve half his own board. I turned to look at him, and he was watching me with an expression far too sincere for a man who, 20 minutes ago, had watched me publicly humiliate someone with a PowerPoint slide. I panicked slightly, in the specific way I only ever panicked around him now. The car's outside, right? I want a burger, a big one. With everything on it, William laughed, actually laughed, right there in the middle of a half-empty ballroom that had spent the entire night watching him for exactly this reaction, and the sound of it turned more heads than the entire scandal had. Somewhere behind us, Ethan calmly typed something into his tablet. Historical event, he said, to no one in particular, and followed us both out into the cold. A month after the Robert Hayes disaster, I decided the engagement had officially served its purpose. Russo Holdings was stable. The Carter family's finances were fixed. No more scandals to survive. Logically, this meant our little contract of convenience could quietly expire. I mentioned this over dinner, very casually, the way you'd mention running out of milk. So, I said, now that everything's settled, we could probably call off the engagement. No hard feelings. William, halfway through pouring wine, went completely still. Why? He said. Not a question, a demand disguised as one. Because the whole point was fixing my family's finances and your board politics, I said. Mission accomplished. James. He set the bottle down with more care than the situation strictly required. I stopped thinking of this as a business arrangement months ago. I opened my mouth for a joke and found for once nothing there. He took my silence as an opening, which in hindsight was probably the plan all along, and got up from the table. The proposal itself happened 3 nights later on the Chicago Riverwalk. No helicopters, no fireworks, no crowd. Just the two of us, and a very cold evening, exactly the way I'd have chosen it if anyone had asked, which of course William had noticed without me ever saying so. He reached into his coat pocket for the ring and dropped it, watched it roll 6 feet down the pavement toward the river. I have never, in either of my lives, moved faster than the half-second it took me to dive and catch it before it went over the edge. The most feared man in Chicago, I said, breathless, holding the ring up like evidence, just almost lost an engagement ring to Lake Michigan. His ears were doing the thing. The full, spectacular red. It slipped. You're panicking. I'm not panicking. William, your hands are shaking. It's cold. It's 68 degrees. He gave up arguing, took the ring back from me, got down on one knee properly this time, and asked, quiet, unpolished, nothing like the composed boardroom voice I'd gotten used to, marry me? I made him wait exactly 15 seconds, mostly out of professional habit, before I said yes. The wedding happened that spring in New York. White flowers, dark suits instead of dresses, no one referring to me as anything but husband, which I insisted on loudly and often just to watch William's family adjust. Ethan stood near the front with his tablet, presumably still taking notes. Charles attended, freshly humbled by a full year of compliance paperwork, and gave a toast that was suspiciously well-behaved. Even Michael showed up, sat in the back, and left me a card that just said fine, I get it now. Rosalind sat in the front row in a coral dress that matched the pantsuit from our first meeting, dabbing her eyes and loudly informing anyone nearby that she'd known it was lemon cake weather since the very beginning. Ethan gave a toast too, right before dinner, tapping his glass with the same tablet he'd carried through the entire engagement. For the record, he said, I have 11 months of notes documenting William Russo's ears turning red. I'm publishing none of it out of professional courtesy, but I wanted on the record that I called this in week 2. He raised his glass toward us. To the only 2 people in Chicago capable of making each other this ridiculous. I caught William's eye across the table. His ears, predictably, were already red. When the officiant asked William if he took me, I leaned in and whispered, last chance to back out. I do, he said immediately, no hesitation at all. I've had enough time to think, William said, and his ears went red in front of 200 guests, which I've decided is my favorite noise-free sound in the world. 2 years later, we still live in the same penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, and I have, if anything, gotten more lazy, not less. Last week I set off the smoke alarm trying to make grilled cheese, a task that requires precisely 0 classified skills and which I still somehow failed. William walked in, took one look at the pan, and rebuilt the sandwich from scratch without a single comment, which was somehow more humiliating than if he'd said something. We've also entered a permanent Cold War over the television remote. I hide it under the couch cushion. He finds it within 4 minutes every single time, a skill I refuse to admit is impressive. Our dog, a rescue mutt named Biscuit that Ethan talked us into adopting, adores me unconditionally, and treats William like a mildly suspicious intruder who happens to pay for his food. William, a man once feared by 3 rival families, has been quietly trying to win over a 20-pound dog for 8 months and losing. Last night, from the couch, without lifting my head from the pillow, William, I want water. He was 2 rooms away, reading contracts. He got up anyway. Ethan, visiting for dinner, watched this happen and asked, deeply unbothered, does he not have legs? CIA retirement plan, I told him. Full husband service included. William, from the kitchen, didn't even look up. Ignore him. I didn't stop smiling for the rest of the night. The ugly burgundy armchair is still in the living room, by the way. Rosalind visits every few months and always sits in it on purpose, just to remind William that his own grandmother thinks his husband has better taste than he does. William has offered, on at least 3 separate occasions, to have it accidentally donated. I have hidden the donation pickup slip each time. We both know I'll win eventually, mostly because he'd rather lose an argument about furniture than watch me sulk about it for a week. Biscuit, for what it's worth, has started sleeping on William's side of the bed the moment he leaves for an early meeting, then relocating with theatrical reluctance the second he hears William's key in the door. William pretends not to notice. I've caught him leaving treats on the nightstand anyway, quietly, like a man bribing a very small, very unimpressed jury. I spent my old life reading people for a living, watching for the lie behind the smile, the thing everyone's hiding. I never once expected the hardest person to read would turn out to be the one who'd end up loving me the most, ears going red every single time I call him husband, like it's still the first time. Turns out the whole make him hate me plan never stood a chance. And it turns out the version of myself I liked best wasn't the sharpest operative in a locked room. It was the lazy, smart-mouthed disaster currently stealing his husband's suit jackets and demanding water from across the apartment. Some people go their whole lives looking for a place to finally stop performing. I just had to get transmigrated into one to find it. If you made it all the way here, thank you for sticking around through every disaster, gala scandal, and burnt grilled cheese. Drop a comment with your favorite moment. Follow the channel for more of James and William's chaos, and I'll see you in the next one.